This video was sponsored by Card Kingdom. You can visit their store by using my referral link in the description below. Hi everyone, I'm Nitsa Hone, and it's Wednesday, and that means it's time for another deck history. In this series, I look at the history of deck archetypes that have been successful at Magic's highest level of competition, starting from the first time a particular deck emerged, and ending with the modern day. I always run a poll that lets viewers have a say in what the topic of these videos will be, and in the last poll, I put Affinity and Splinter Twin up against one another, with Affinity really blowing out Splinter Twin entirely. So, Affinity is going to be the topic of today's video. Affinity decks get their name from the Affinity mechanic, which made its debut in Miradin. It's a mechanic that reduces the mana cost of a spell by the number of permanents you have of a certain type. In particular, the Affinity cards that tend to be played in Affinity decks are those that have Affinity for artifacts, and Affinity decks are aggro decks loaded up with artifacts and artifact payoffs. The name became so heavily associated with this type of deck that eventually artifact aggro decks that run few or even no cards with the Affinity mechanic are still called Affinity decks. In other words, eventually the archetype has nothing to do with Affinity, so it really is best to define it as an artifact aggro deck, though we'll see there are certainly still some characteristic cards for the archetype that stay true throughout its history. It just so happens none of them have Affinity. At one point or another, Affinity decks have found success in Block, Standard, Extended, Modern, and Legacy, and the deck has been so powerful in so many formats that various bans have had to nerf it throughout its history. In this video, we'll take a look at the notable iterations of the deck over the years, examining how Affinity decks have changed over time and why. The story of Affinity all begins with the release of Miradin in October of 2003. It was designed as an artifact block, and it was set on a world where artifacts were everywhere. This led to lots of new powerful artifacts being printed, with Affinity for artifacts being one of the most powerful things that Miradin block did. The first time Affinity emerged as a powerful force at Magic's highest level of competition was at Pro Tour Kobe in 2004, where the top 8 was made up of Affinity decks and decks designed to beat Affinity. That tells you a lot about how powerful Affinity decks were already, since the entire format was warped around it. Ben Stark's version of the deck was fairly emblematic of what the deck looked like in Block Constructed. He, of course, ran a bunch of artifacts and a bunch of cards that paid you off for having them, including cards with Affinity, like Frogmite and Mirror Enforcer. Those cards look super inefficient, but this deck could cast them for free with regularity. On its own, Affinity probably would have been a pretty powerful mechanic, especially with 0 mana artifacts around to reduce the cost of spells, but the deck was made completely busted by the presence of artifact lands. Miradin featured 5 of them, 1 for each color, and Darksteel had a colorless one, Darksteel Citadel. These lands effectively tap for 2 mana for every single one of your cards with Affinity, and, as you can imagine, that's just insane. It wasn't hard for an Affinity deck in Miradin Block Constructed to just dump their entire hand on the table on turn 1 or 2 by chaining together a bunch of artifact lands, 0 mana artifacts, and artifacts with Affinity. Another key card for the deck, and the one that is certainly the most iconic card of Affinity decks, is Arcbound Ravager. The Ravager may not have Affinity itself, but his ability to gobble up artifacts and turn them into +1/+1 counters is incredibly powerful, especially because he also has Modular and can move the counters around. In other words, killing the Ravager won't fix your problems, it will just create a new one. And in addition to all of that, the deck also ran Disciple of the Vault, which made your opponent lose a life anytime an artifact went to the graveyard. That, combined with the Ravager, could do absurd amounts of damage in a hurry. Remember, almost all the permanents in this deck are artifacts, including the lands. Lethal damage really wasn't very hard to find. Another broken thing about this version of Affinity is Skull Clamp, a card that was legal only very briefly in both Block and Standard because it's completely absurd. It could turn all of your small creatures into more cards, which you would probably just be able to play right away because Affinity. You could stick it on a creature you wanted to sacrifice it to your Ravager, and probably draw some free artifacts to add even more damage. This would be the only Miradin Block Pro Tour, so there aren't any other Affinity decks to talk about in the format. Now, let's move to Standard, where Affinity decks also emerged in 2004, about a month after Pro Tour Kobe. Affinity decks got their first top 8s in Standard at Grand Prix Brussels, where they were 2 of the top 8 decks. Hall of Famer Kai Buddha managed a second place finish there, and there were not a ton of differences from the Affinity deck that top 8'd Pro Tour Kobe in Block Constructed just a few months earlier. It had all the cheap artifacts and cards with affinity for artifacts, as well as the Arcbound Ravager, Disciple of the Vault combo. This version of Affinity also utilized Shrapnel Blast, which could do the last few damage if you ran out of gas. You'll note, this deck also uses Skull Clamp, which was banned after this event, causing later Affinity decks to look a bit different. Even without Skull Clamp, the deck would go on to significant success in Standard for the remainder of 2004, and there were 2 additional cards introduced in the later Affinity decks of the year. At the 2004 World Championships, 3 of the decks to top 8 were Affinity decks, and they all made use of 2 cards that earlier versions of the deck hadn't: Cranial Plating and Blinkmoth Nexus. Cranial Plating gave you another source of enormous damage in addition to Disciple of the Vault and Arcbound Ravager, and in tandem with them, it could be particularly ridiculous, especially if you had some black mana around, since you could move it at instant speed, just like you could move Arcbound Ravager's counters at instant speed. Blinkmoth Nexus was an artifact creature land, and importantly it had flying, which meant that if your opponent was vulnerable in the air, you could put your Cranial Plating on it, or a bunch of +1/+1 counters from Arcbound Ravager, and do a ton of damage. Both Cranial Plating and Blinkmoth Nexus would go on, along with Arcbound Ravager, to be fixtures in Affinity decks and other formats. But Affinity decks didn't top 8 any more Standard Premier events after the 2004 World Championships, and this is because the deck was utterly torn apart with bannings, and it really had to be done. The deck was absurd, and it actually led to a major exodus of players from the game who became disillusioned as a result of Affinity. Arcbound Ravager, Disciple of the Vault, and all the artifact lands were banned out of the format, and Affinity was dead in Standard. However, Affinity would have a long life in other formats, with Extended the next one to see Affinity decks, which would also show up there in late 2004. If you don't know, Extended is a now-defunct rotating format where the last several years of cards are legal. Pierre Canali was the first to take Affinity to the top 8 of an Extended Premier event, which he did at Pro Tour Columbus in 2004. In a lot of ways, Pierre's deck was just the pre-banned Standard version of Affinity, ported to Modern. It ran a bunch of artifact lands, a bunch of cheap artifact creatures, and cards with Affinity, Disciple of the Vault, Arcbound Ravager, Blinkmoth Nexus, and Cranial Plating. One difference was that it did utilize Aether Vial, a card that wasn't always in earlier versions of Affinity. The Vial could allow you to get out even more artifact creatures, and it could do it at instant speed. Turns out Affinity was also super busted in Extended, a format that was significantly stronger than either Block or Standard, but both Aether Vial and Disciple of the Vault got banned in Extended in early 2005, and without those 2 cards, Affinity decks, for a time, disappeared from the top tier in Extended. However, the deck returned in 2009 with 2 top 8s at Grand Prix Los Angeles. While the core of the deck was the same as it had been in the past, 2 new cards allowed Affinity to get back on top: Springleaf Drum and Master of Ethereum. The Drum gave you a cheap artifact that could produce mana, further enabling you to quickly play your artifact creatures, and Master of Ethereum was an artifact lord who got massive the more artifacts you had in play. The deck also utilized Fatal Frenzy, as it could be used to easily one-shot opponents with a huge artifact creature pumped by things like Cranial Plating and +1/+1 counters. It also brought back a card that appeared in some of the earlier Affinity decks in Atog, which could sort of stand in for Arcbound Ravager, making the deck really focused on that one-shot win strategy. 2009 would be the last time an Affinity deck would top 8 an Extended event, as the format was gone by 2011. However, Affinity decks would have plenty of other formats as their playground. Let's take a look now at Modern, the format that replaced Extended, and also the format where Affinity would find the most sustained success, and also the place where Affinity decks would cease having any cards with Affinity in them at all. So, Modern was created in 2011, and it came with a list of cards that were banned before competitive play in the new format even began, and Affinity was clearly one of the decks targeted by these bans. All the artifact lands were banned, with the exception of Darksteel Citadel. However, while the Affinity decks of Modern would certainly be powered down by that banning, they pretty much immediately became a Tier 1 deck in Modern. They banned enough to keep it from being busted, but the deck was still legitimately powerful. After all, they still had access to Arcbound Ravager and many other important cards. The first Modern Affinity deck to achieve a top 8 was Chikara Nakajima's Mono Red Affinity at Pro Tour Philadelphia in 2011, which was the very first Modern Pro Tour ever. Affinity was a deck in Modern literally from day one. This version of Affinity used a lot of things we've already seen, like Arcbound Ravager, Frogmite, Ornithopter, Cranial Plating, and Springleaf Drum, but there were some important new cards that powered up Affinity significantly and allowed it to become such a major player in Modern for pretty close to a decade. So let's talk about those. We returned to Miradin in 2010 and 2011's Scars of Miradin block, and most of the cards that powered up the deck, fittingly enough, came from these new Miradin sets. Let's start with Mox Opal, which is probably the most important piece of the puzzle. In an Affinity deck, Mox Opal was pretty close to being an upgraded version of the Power 9 Moxen. It was that easy to get Metalcraft with it. And sure, it's legendary, but you can just tap it and feed it to your Ravager before playing an additional copy, so the downside isn't that big. There were also a few new creatures that were a big help, namely Memnite, Signal Pest, and Vault Scourge. Memnite gave the deck access to another free artifact creature. Signal Pest could pump the whole board when it attacked, and it was also difficult to block, making it a great place to put a Cranial Plating or plus and plus one counters. And Vault Scourge was effectively a 1-mana 1/1 with flying and lifelink, and another great creature to pump with your various effects. There was also a new creature land to pair with Blinkmoth Nexus in Inkmoth Nexus, which was basically Blinkmoth Nexus, but with Infect, so you only needed to do 10 with it to win the game, and the deck was pretty darn good at doing that. Mono Red Affinity was the primary form of the deck in 2011, and a lot of Chikara's deck was doing things that Affinity decks would go on to do in Modern for a very long time. In particular, the new artifact creatures in the deck, and Inkmoth Nexus would be fixtures in the deck going forward. However, in early 2012, a new Affinity variant emerged. These red-white Affinity decks had a lot of similarities with mono-red Affinity, but there were also some significant differences. One of them was the use of Steel Overseer, a powerful artifact payoff that continually adds plus and plus one counters to your guys, which you can get some additional value out of with Arcbound Ravager. The deck also ran Etched Champion, a Metalcraft creature who gained protection from all colors, so it was often completely unkillable and unblockable, and because the deck had so many ways to make it huge, that was pretty awesome. This version of Affinity ran white primarily for Steel Shaper's Gift, and in general the deck was more focused on getting Cranial Plating going, which made sense because the deck had so many evasive creatures to put it on. This is also the first deck to use the Affinity name, despite not having a single card in it with actual Affinity. That would be something that continued to happen in Modern going forward. Like Mono-Red Affinity, Red-White Affinity was not a long-lived version of the deck, as by later 2012 it was largely supplanted by Mono-Blue Affinity decks, which ran blue to gain access to Master of Ethereum and Thoughtcast. Thoughtcast is a card that was in most earlier versions of Affinity before Modern, but it had yet to make an appearance in that format. It tends to cost only a single mana to draw 2 cards in Affinity decks, which is pretty awesome. And in 2013, the deck underwent another minor change, with most versions opting to go blue-red to get the best of both Mono-Red Affinity and Mono-Blue Affinity decks, which basically means Thoughtcast and Galvanic Blast. Blast was utilized by most of the previous Mono-Red and Red-White decks, and it often just feels like a better lightning bolt in Affinity decks. From this point on, Thoughtcast tended to really be the only card with Affinity left in Affinity decks, and some people didn't even run that. This would become the typical form of Affinity decks from 2013 to 2020, but there were some minor variations and a few new cards here and there that we'll talk about. One of these variations came in 2015 in a deck that Robbie Schmidt top-8'd Grand Prix Vancouver with. Magic 2015's Ensoul Artifact was now in the deck, and it could be particularly potent when placed on Darksteel Citadel or Ornithopter. This didn't become a change that all Affinity players made, but decks utilizing Ensoul Artifact top-8'd various events between 2015 and 2018. Another addition to Affinity decks that affected the archetype more broadly came in 2017. Kaladesh block came in 2016 and 2017, and it gave us another artifact-heavy set. The main difference this set made for Affinity decks was the introduction of 2 new artifact payoff lands, Spire of Industry and Inventor's Fair. The Spire made the mana for Affinity decks excellent, to the point that it was even possible to play Collected Company, like Takeshi Kagawa did. Meanwhile, Inventor's Fair could gain you life when you got enough artifacts, and then it could tutor up a key artifact if you had enough artifacts in play. Spire of Industry especially became a fixture in future Affinity decks. In 2018, Modern Affinity would undergo another minor change with the addition of Karn, Scion of Urza. This new Planeswalker could draw you cards, and he came with a -2 ability that was an artifact payoff. His ability to crank out big tokens was especially nice for Affinity. So, for much of the history of Affinity decks in Modern, the deck stayed pretty consistent with only a few minor changes here and there, but in 2019 the deck would undergo an incredibly drastic transformation, one so massive that eventually Affinity would leave the deck's name entirely. This new version of Affinity, Hardened Affinity, didn't run nearly as many artifact payoffs as earlier versions of the deck had. Instead, the deck was mostly based around plus and plus one counters, which could be abused thanks to hardened scales. By 2019, there was a critical mass of powerful artifact creatures who liked plus and plus one counters, including the omnipresent Arcbound Ravager, as well as Hangerback Walker and Walking Ballista. This version of the deck was still about killing people quickly with artifact creatures, but it ran fewer creatures and was significantly more combo-oriented, seeking to win the game by moving plus and plus one counters all over the place and multiplying them. You could do damage the normal way, of course, attacking, but you could also just quickly one-shot someone with Walking Ballista after sacrificing a bunch of artifacts to your Ravager, then sacrificing the Ravager to itself and putting all the counters on your Ballista. This gave the deck a way to win at instant speed, and that was a pretty big deal. And because the deck was green, it also had access to Ancient Stirrings and Evolutionary Leap, which could help you assemble your combo kill. Over time, the Affinity part of the name dropped off, and the deck came to simply be called Hardened Scales, as the deck was significantly different from those that came before it. For one thing, it ran about 10 fewer creatures than typical Affinity did. In short, Hardened Scales became the home for Arcbound Ravager in Modern, and there was no longer a deck that we would call Affinity. And in early 2020, something really bad happened that doesn't bode well for Affinity's future. Other artifact decks in the format began really abusing Mox Opal, resulting in the card being banned in the format. This weakened Hardened Scales substantially, and dealt potentially a killing blow to Affinity, a deck that was already not in a great position. We may have seen the last of Affinity decks in Modern, but Modern Horizons 2 did recently introduce a new set of artifact lands, not to mention some new cards with Affinity and some other pretty strong artifacts. So there's at least a little bit of hope that the archetype might find some success in the future, even without Mox Opal. While Affinity never found the same level of success in other formats that it did in Modern, it did still find some success in Legacy and, arguably, Vintage, the last two formats for us to talk about. Let's talk about Legacy first. While Affinity decks were on the fringes for a while in Legacy, an Affinity deck didn't find substantial success in Legacy until 2018, when Johan de Gruyter top-8'd Grand Prix Birmingham with it. Much of his deck looks like the ones we've already seen, but a key difference is access to significant fast mana in addition to Mox Opal in lands like Ancient Tomb and City of Traders. Like other Affinity decks, this deck looks to quickly play their whole hand, but it backs that up by hindering an opponent's ability to interact with tax and prison artifacts like Lodestone Golem and Thorn of Amethyst. These effects end up being pretty much one-sided, since the deck is mostly creatures and entirely artifacts. This allows the deck to just run people over while they try to find the mana to cast their newly more expensive spells. So there is one more format to talk about, and that's Vintage. Vintage does not technically have an Affinity deck, but there are decks in Vintage that are very similar to the Affinity strategy, in that their strategy revolves around playing a bunch of artifact creatures and killing the opponent with them, and Arcbound Ravager is important to this plan. These artifact aggro decks ultimately evolved from Mud, a less aggressive artifact deck that sought to use prison and tax effects to hurt the opponent, while it used massive mana from Mishra's Workshop to get way ahead on the board. Eventually, both Lodestone Golem and Thorn of Amethyst ended up getting restricted in Vintage as a result of this deck's power, and this cleared the way for a more aggressive artifact deck that came to be called Ravager Shops. This deck still utilizes some of the Mud strategies, but it cut way down on prison cards like Tanglewire and added a bunch more creatures, seeking to win the game the traditional way that Affinity decks tend to, by attacking and playing their whole hand quickly. So yeah, Ravager Shops is not technically an Affinity deck, but it's not wildly different from Legacy Affinity, and as a result, I think it deserved a mention here. Affinity's future looks somewhat uncertain in Modern, and it has never been a major force in Legacy or Vintage unless you count Ravager Shops, so there may not be a whole lot more to say about Affinity in the future. But it has an impressive past, completely breaking block in Standard and Extended to a lesser degree. It was a dominant deck in Modern from day one and maintained that status for almost a decade, which is an impressive feat in itself. There aren't very many decks with such impressive longevity. Well, that's the history of Affinity decks. If you want to have a say in what the topic of next week's video is, you can vote on a poll that's up on my community tab right now. If you enjoyed this video, like it and share it where you can so that more people see it. If you want to make sure you catch future episodes of this and other series, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past deck histories, you should see the playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.